Hi, this is Dr. Kessler. This is lecture 3. In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of the phases of the strategic planning process. You'll recall in our previous lecture, we discussed how to get ready for the strategic planning process and making sure everyone's involved, the right people, and putting our committees together and building a plan of meetings and timetable and schedule. In the second phase, we talked about conducting a situational assessment and spent a lot of time and effort trying to emphasize the importance of really looking at how the world has changed and what our customers want and where our place is in the world and whether we're aligned properly with the external environment. And that's extremely important. So for this lecture, we'll assume that those two phases are substantially completed. We'll also assume that the situational assessment report has been developed and distributed to the participants in the strategic planning activity. At this point, we'll assume that a 2-day session off-site has been scheduled with the leadership and that we're going to use that time to try to get as much information as possible out of the leadership so that we can really develop a strategic plan. And so in our phase 3, during the off-site session, we'll spend a lot of time trying to validate the mission, vision, and values of the organization. Given the situation that we're facing, has our mission expanded or changed, and do we need to revise the mission statement? We'll talk about how to have a vision statement that is dynamic and motivational, and we won't mention a lot about values, but we'll briefly discuss about having values that could be incorporated. Again, this phase 3 is done after the situational assessment and at the beginning of the 2-day strategic planning session. Phase 4 is really where we stop talking broadly about the organization and we really get down to saying, given the recent discussion of the situational assessment, what should be our strategic goals and our strategic objectives? And so we'll talk about that as well. And so let's dig into these next two steps of the strategic planning process. So phase 3 is validating the mission and the vision and the values. We're making assumptions, of course, that phases 1 and 2 are completed. We're making an assumption that the situational assessment report developed in phase 2 has been distributed to all the participants, and that our next major activity is the off-site retreat, typically a 2-day session, and that an agenda has been prepared and distributed. So now we're into the welcoming and the opening comments of our 2-day session, and we need to use this time wisely because it's real easy for 2 days to slip away quickly and not have all the things that we need to have in order to develop and write the strategic plan. So the first thing we need to appreciate is how much we have to do over the next 2 days. We have to have the opening comments, we have to discuss the situational assessment, and potentially we have to revise our mission, vision, and values. The situational assessment is really going to determine what our outcome-oriented goals and objectives are going to be, so we have to have those goals and objectives formulated at the end of the 2 days. And we have to formulate strategies and performance measures to achieve those goals and objectives. I mean, why have outcomes that you want to achieve if in fact you don't formulate the plans, the actions, the strategies to cause that to happen? And then we need to discuss the next steps of this 2-day session about how to finish up anything we haven't finished, how to get the strategic plan drafted, written, reviewed, disseminated, etc. We'll talk about all that in subsequent discussion. So effective time management is hugely successful at this point in the process. The earlier discussions we've had this semester about the main thing is extremely important. That's what we're trying to do when we validate the mission and vision here in phase 3. And so we need to ask ourselves once again, given our discussion of the situational assessment, what is the main thing that this organization exists to do? And so we need to make sure that that's done. And so assumption here, of course, is that the pre-work has been done and that we've got the situational assessment done, and possibly you might consider some preliminary discussion of the mission and vision at a meeting before the off-site 2-day session. If you're able to do that, you can use the time in the 2 days to actually work on your goals and objectives. But if you haven't, then you have to use the morning of the first day to validate the mission and vision, and that's what this slide says. So after you have your opening comments and everybody's had their coffee and waters and stuff, we're going to begin the retreat by having the main thing discussion. And I've done many strategic planning sessions, and I always begin by validating the main thing of the organization. Sometimes a mission statement just sounds a little too much like it was written by lawyers, and it doesn't sound, in real words what we do and why we exist. And so we need to spend some time at the beginning of the session validating our mission, validating our main thing. And then from there, we can segue into, whether or not we need to make any changes to the legalese, to the words of our mission, vision, and values. So in terms of starting the discussion of the mission and the vision, I always like to refer to the example of Jim Barksdale, who in 1995 founded an organization in his garage called Netscape Corporation. And Netscape actually invented the first web browser that all of us now use browsers to scan the internet. But prior to 1995, there was no consumer-oriented internet to speak of. None of us used internet, didn't know what it was or how to use it. You all see the recent commercial with the two morning anchors back in 1995 saying, what is the internet? So-and-so, what is the internet? And so that was a true situation. But Jim Barksdale's Netscape Corporation introduced the first browser. It was called Netscape. And after a period of time, it was so successful that Jim Barksdale had to gather all his people into the cafeteria and say, people, we're losing our focus here. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Because what had happened at that time to Netscape was they had gotten so focused on process, on shrink wrapping the packages, on putting the DVDs into the boxes, on shipping the boxes, collecting the money, etc. The process had become the main thing. And while that's not always a terrible thing because you have to have a good process, there happened to be a company in Seattle, Washington named Microsoft. And during the time that Netscape took its eye off the main thing, Microsoft and Bill Gates, who was very upset that he hadn't come up with the browser idea, created a browser called Internet Explorer. And over time, Internet Explorer started to take market share and take market share and take market share. So Netscape, rather than compete with a great browser and make a better browser, got busy shipping boxes of browsers, and therefore the guy had to make the statement to the organization. It didn't work. Netscape was eventually sold to AOL, and no one uses Netscape Navigator anymore. Ironically, very few people use Internet Explorer anymore. Most people use something like Chrome or Apple's Safari or Mozilla. And so it's interesting that even the Microsoft Internet Explorer took its eye off the ball after a period of time. So what I'm saying here, though, is you have to start the meeting with outcomes. You have to affirm why your organization exists. What is the outcome of what we do? What services do we sell to our consumers? Have our consumer desires and needs changed? Have we sort of shifted what we do from where we originally were? And if we did, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does the public have confidence in what we do? Are our stakeholders better off? Is the economy better off? And so on and so forth. So having this discussion, really from the root of what the organization is all about is extremely important. So that has to take place quickly. It has to be done. And then we have to come back and ask ourselves if our mission statement needs to be adjusted. Excuse me. So mission statement, what is the ultimate result we're trying to achieve? It answers the question, why does our organization exist, and why is it going to exist in the coming years? It talks about how the organization is going to achieve its ultimate results. And so we need to validate that. We also need to have a discussion of the vision statement. And there's a lot of terrible vision statements out there. There are things where people want to be like, Gandhi. They want to say, world peace is our vision, which means nothing, right? And so if I gave you all, each of you students, a vision that you would have your master's degree completed in 3 years, and then your vision would be to go on and complete a doctorate, that would be a powerful vision because it would motivate you, right? But if I said that you're going to be happy in your life, not a great vision statement. So you'll see a lot of vision statements that are like meaningless, right? They sound good, but they don't mean anything. And so a vision statement really is a guiding image of success. It has to inspire, it has to energize, it has to be specific and measurable, it has to describe an outcome, and it has to invoke a vivid mental picture of where we, our organization, or we personally are going to be in the future. And there's lots of great visions. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, John F. Kennedy put a man on the moon and returned safely to Earth within the next decade. These are great, memorable mission statements. And then here's an example. There will be a personal computer on every desk running Microsoft software. Well, it's specific, it's measurable. At the time that vision statement was used, it was not true. And therefore, because it was not true, it was really a good vision statement of pushing people to try to achieve something that they'd never achieved before. I'm going to run my first marathon before I'm 40. It's not true now because you haven't run a marathon. And, those are really good vision statements. The values focus on, and values are very powerful things. They talk about basically the things that an organization wants to push and promote and make sure are present in the work environment, so that people kind of conform and understand what the organization is all about. And so that's phase 3. We've got to get the mission, vision, and values. We've got to spend some time on it, but not too much time. Again, I suggest that possibly you could have a meeting about those things prior to the 2-day offsite session. That would save you some time on the 2-day offsite session to really dig into the details. So now we're into phase 4. Phase 4 is to agree on our priorities. And so how do we agree on the priorities? What does it mean to agree on the priorities? It means setting our goals and our objectives, right? And so we begin this discussion by having everyone react to the situational assessment. Were all the major things that you could think of included? If there was anything missed, it needs to be added. And what do we conclude about this report? Are things perfect in the organization, or are there things that need to be addressed, especially big things? And it's the big things that constitute the framework for saying our goals ought to be someplace that revolve around those big things. And so, and we need to make sure we've addressed major issues, but we need to also recognize that when we tackle tough things, it means making difficult choices. There's a lot of reasons why strategic planning doesn't go well. It's because some people participating in the process have territories they want to protect. And difficult choices sometimes require tearing the organization apart and putting it back together again. So we have to appreciate again, and I mentioned this in earlier lectures, that senior leadership has to say what it wants to do with this process. Does it really want to take on the tough things? So we use the situational assessment to determine our goals and objectives. Now, we have a dilemma when we get to this point. Managers come into this meeting representing different parts of the organization: manufacturing, shipping, design, raw material inventory, whatever. And those managers all want to have a goal in the strategic plan for their own organization. But that's not what we're going to let happen. We are going to have goals for all of the organization as a whole. And if those managers then want to develop a subordinate strategic plan, fine, let them do it. But be careful in terms of goals dilemma, not to let the setting of goals become sort of every person gets one. And it's not what it's all about. It's about forgetting you're in a department, imagining you're the CEO, and you have to get everyone in the room to do that. You're the CEO. What's best for the organization? Where does the organization need to go? And so we need to set our goals. Goals are end statements. They need to be worded as end statements. And any goal that begins with the word continue is going to find high displeasure in Dr. Kessler's class, right? We're not going to have any continue goals. Our goals are always going to be something we want to achieve, some outcome. And they're going to represent a desired future state. And we're going to be able to do that by using performance measures, and we'll talk about that later. What are objectives? Objectives are not different than goals. They're really a decomposition of the goals. So if the goal is to win the war, the objectives are parts, or pieces, or steps, or phases of causing the goal to be implemented, causing the goal to be achieved. So objectives are structured under each goal to support the goal achievement. They are precise, measurable, and they're time-phased, and we'll talk about that later. Parts and objective, we talked about goals. Goals have to be structured as outcomes, very specific. They're end statements. By 2020, every person in America will have a GoPro camera or something like that, right? And so then we have to have strategies to cause that to happen. And the objectives underneath of that goal, making sure everyone in America has a GoPro camera, has to be broken down. Well, what does that mean? Young people will have GoPro cameras for all sports activity. Middle-aged people will use GoPro cameras to record day-to-day routine, whatever. And so we take the big goal and we break it down to objectives. Our objectives this semester and in good strategic planning have to use the following format. They have to talk about a change direction. That means a goal, an objective has to say we're going to reduce something, increase something, strengthen something. It has to have an action-oriented verb kind of statement at the beginning. It has to have a target. What's going to be reduced? What's going to be increased? What's going to be strengthened? Is it unemployment? Is it sales? Is it penetration? Is it international? What is it? It needs to have a target population, and so we're going to increase sales of GoPro cameras among young people. That's your target population, right? So it has to have that element as well. And then two other pieces, which we'll get into later. It has to talk about by how much, right? And that's performance measures. And it has to talk about a time frame, over what time frame, because you can't really say you've achieved an objective unless it's specific and measurable. And so recognize that these last two things, how much and over what time frame, we'll get into using performance measures a little bit later. This is an example of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They identified a number of years ago some issues during their situational assessment, including cyber terrorism, gang-related crime, and financial and white-collar crime. And therefore, the goals were derived from those issues that the nation was going to be positioned to deter, prevent, and counter cyber terrorism attacks. Right? So you see that's specific. It was not a situation that existed at the time. So they weren't going to continue this. They were going to do this. Gang-related crime was going to be declining instead of increasing. And then finally, the third goal was law enforcement was going to have the capability to detect and obtain evidence of financial and white-collar crime. So you can note that these goals are future desired states. They're outcomes. Okay? And we're going to talk a lot about having our goals oriented as outcomes. Also notice that they're externally oriented. They're not about our personnel are retiring and we have to worry about that. They're not about morale or supervision or leadership. We're going to get into those issues, but for now we're focused on the organization's outcomes. Now we take and break those outcomes down, those goals down into objectives. You can see that the nation being positioned to deter, prevent, and counter cyber terrorism is kind of general, right? It's an important outcome, but it's generalized. So we break that down, and you can see it was broken down into three objectives: strengthen federal government defenses, assist the private sector, and improve detection, prevention, and countermeasures. So you can sort of see that each of these objectives underneath the goals are sort of broken down into like more detail about the outcome that's desired. So spend some time looking at this slide. I'm going to move on so we can get through the lecture. But recognize the importance of goals as outcomes and objectives as specific measurable things that added together achieve the goal. And so you can look at that. I'm going to skip past this slide. Okay, so major points of Lecture 3. We talked about Phase 3, validating the mission, having a measurable, achievable future vision statement that's inspirational. We talked about phase 4, coming up with the goals and objectives based on situational assessment. And that's a huge part of strategic planning. An effective facilitator can get the right goals and the right objectives set up, and then everything else in the rest of the session flows from there. So let me just continue on here with part 2 of the lecture. The phase 5, the strategic planning process needs to be facilitated, and then a plan needs to be written. And so I'd like to talk about those things just a little bit. So in terms of facilitating the process, we need to understand how to make sure that all the pieces come together. We need to understand what to get done in the 2-day offsite session. Now we need to understand what happens after the 2-day session in order to get the strategic plan written. We need to recognize the skills necessary to engage the people in reviewing and discussing the situational assessment and developing, based on that discussion, a set of comprehensive forward-looking goals and objectives. The offsite session, we're going to review and discuss the situational assessment, develop our goals and objectives, formulate, discuss, rank, and select strategies. If we have time, we're going to do performance measures as well. Often that the time runs out. Is the facilitation role important or not? Absolutely. After phase 4, we've got our goal and objective framework in place. Our goals are focused on outcomes derived from the situational assessment. And we have to have our strategies in place as well. So then we have to step back and understand what it takes to really facilitate the strategic planning process to get all these parts done. The quality of the strategic plan depends substantially on the ability of those facilitating the process to get the milestones met, to develop preparatory and support things such as the situational assessment, to guide the participants in the offsite session, and then to pull all the elements together into a comprehensive and accurate strategic plan. Now it also includes taking the plan that's written and vetting it, making sure that the employees have understood it and have some input and buy-in, and as well as other key stakeholders. It also means positioning the organization to implement the strategic plan, to monitor its implementation, and to make adjustments as we go along. So in terms of the facilitation role, the strategic planning quality often depends on how well the facilitators did their jobs. Facilitators have to be prepared to get it done no matter what it takes. They need to meet with agency leadership up front to discuss what leadership wants to have accomplished. They need to organize and make sure that different groups come together and get their work done. There's a strategic planning steering group we've talked about, a situational assessment work group we've talked about, a strategy implementation or development team, and then strategy implementation teams. Recognize also that the facilitators set the agendas for the meeting. They ensure that the situational assessment is conducted, that it's thorough, that it's supported by facts and evidence and not opinion. They need to disseminate the situational assessment before the offsite meeting so that participants have lots of time to review and digest what's been included. They have to facilitate the 2-day offsite strategic planning session and have to finish any tasks not completed at the offsite session. Assuming that the goals have been developed and the objectives have been developed and that implementation strategies have been developed as well. If performance measures were not included, they need to get them included, and they often need to refine partially developed or missing strategies. So there's a lot of work to do. They also need to finish the strategic plan, distribute for review and comments, and incorporate any feedback. They need to determine and execute the approach for distributing the plan to employees and stakeholders so we can get a strategic plan that people are going to believe and buy into. Implementation teams often are necessary to refine strategies into actions, tasks, roles, and responsibilities, monitoring and reporting on implementation progress, and causing adjustments to be made as needed. So you can see it's a fairly daunting thing to be a facilitator for a strategic planning process. Some examples of challenges you run into as a facilitator: the senior leaders have to approve the plan, but they haven't participated, so that could create problems. One agency I did a plan for, there were 2 Democrats and 1 Republican on a oversight board, and the 2 Democrats wanted the plan to say some things, and the Republican didn't like that, so it required that I, as a facilitator, had to go between all 3 back and forth negotiate and compromise to get something. And the agency folks were swearing that we would never get a signed plan, but after a lot of shuttle diplomacy, in fact, all 3 board members signed the agency's strategic plan. Another agency that I worked with, the senior officers were near retirement. The plan initially had things in it that were dramatic and substantial and would certainly have caught the media attention. But the senior officers were all near retirement, did not want to make waves, and did not permit that plan to be published. Recognize also that whoever your administrative officer is, they're going to want an admin goal. It's better to have a separate admin plan, but if you can't, then throwing in the final goal as an admin goal, which covers personnel, budget, technology, facilities, etc., is okay, but that's one goal at the bottom of the plan, maybe the 4th or 5th goal. Also, there's often frustrated or angry staff who didn't participate, and they resent the plan, and they're not going to buy into it at all. And sometimes there's managers who tend to lose some of their staff, or lose some of the scope of what they do, and lose their power. And so they're not happy, and so you have to deal with that as well. The off-site session, recognize the facilitator has to be very knowledgeable about the situational assessment and prepared during the off-site session to lead the discussion about what it means. Also, participants in one strategy is to invite participants to rate the implications of the situational assessment. And this is one thing that I do. I go around and I say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being dire, how do you conclude that the challenges facing the organization are? And I get everybody's scores, and then we can talk about those. Then we try to find consensus that the challenges are substantial or not, create a sense of urgency for the strategic planning session importance, and then make sure that the outcome of the session is to really position the organization to deal with the issues that were written up in the situational assessment. That's why you're doing this, right? It's a change agenda. Strategic goals and associated objectives must capture the intent to overcome the challenges facing the organization. Off-site session, goals and objectives. Goals must be written as end statements. We've talked about this. Objectives have to include the direction of change, so on. We need to develop the objectives during the off-site session, possibly that include direction, area of change, and deal with degree of change time frame, and we'll talk about that later. Off-site session, strategy development process. This is very important because during the off-site session, you've got your goals and your objectives, but now you need strategies to implement them. Strategies really, people get confused over strategies versus actions. Actions are very specific things, like it says, go to meetings or hire staff or whatever, but strategies are a little bit broader. In the strategy development process, the strategic planning team examines options and alternatives to achieve the goals and objectives and then decide which strategies to pursue. And as with all decisions, setting out, the alternative strategies and discussing them is really important, so you can balance the risk and the benefit and cost of these different strategies. And so during the brainstorming phase of strategy development, the participants have to be encouraged to think innovatively and broadly. And I always say to folks, just set aside, because people will say, well, we'll never be able to do blank. We won't have enough money. We won't be allowed to do it, blah, blah, blah. And so I always say, set all the negatives aside, and you just got to say, if there were no barriers, what would be an innovative way to accomplish these objectives and these goals? And so the objective is to capture all the ideas and then sort and decide on them. And then you can sort of come in and put the constraints back in about the risks and the benefits and the costs and unintended consequences and make final decisions about what strategies to use. In terms of refining the strategies have to be then refined down to actions. And you can do this after the strategic planning session. You can organize strategy implementation teams and have those teams study the strategies and really come up with specific detailed work plans for figuring out what actions are necessary to cause the strategies to occur. Just want to mention, I mentioned it before, communication strategies is very essential in this phase. You really got to get buy-in, and so recognizing the plan might have implications for employees, They're going to be anxious, but you've got to sell the plan. And so you've got to communicate to the organization and the employees before you start the process, during the process, and at the end. If possible, asking for input is really important and responding to it. One presentation, we went through the plan with PowerPoint slides, and we gave a handout to everyone, and we had each of the goals, objectives, and strategies, and we wanted people to indicate with a scale and some comments whether they thought this was the right strategy, an important strategy, and make comments. And the whole entire organization, it was a fairly small organization, was able to do this. And even though they may not agree with it or like it, at least they had a chance to voice their views. And so Lecture 3, Part 2, the major points we've discussed here, facilitating the strategic planning process and all the challenges of doing that is really a big deal. And making sure that we understand and appreciate the off-site session and using the off-site session correctly and getting as much done as possible, realizing that we may not get everything done in 2 days and we may have some follow-up activities. But if you can get to this point, if you can appreciate what the facilitation is all about and how to maximize the off-site session, you're really going to be pretty far ahead of things and able to have a reasonably good strategic planning process. That's the end of Lecture 3. We'll continue again in Lecture 4.